Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now, my shoulder is still a little bit too sore to ride. Hopefully it won't be too much longer and I can get back out, avoid the rain showers and the storms which were due today, and get making some riding videos again. But until then, I want to be back here in my garage and show you something which I've kind of alluded to in the past, and it's the most important bike that I own. And no, it's not my brand new Hex that I built in my last video, although this is very important. It's actually these wheels up here, which you may have seen just hanging about in the pack of videos I've done in here before. So I'm gonna put my nice new bike away and show you this nice old bike instead. So here it is. This is the most important bike I own, but it doesn't look like much, does it? It kind of looks like a really old school cross-country bike, and yeah, that's pretty much exactly what it is. This is a 1996 Gt Avalanche. That's probably older than a lot of you guys who've been watching this channel. This, of course, was my first ever decent bike. This is the bike that I started to get serious with riding on. This is the bike that started this whole journey to where we are now making these videos. And believe it or not, this was my very first trials bike. Even though it doesn't look like it, I rode trials on this thing. I did a year's worth of competitions on this bike. Well, I'll be honest with you guys, it wasn't this exact bike. This is a replica. This is a bike I actually saw on Facebook Marketplace. It is exactly the same spec. It is completely original, completely how I had it when I bought this bike, and I just couldn't refuse. Unfortunately, if you've been watching this video, you know that I tried to build up my very original frame, but it did end up cracking. I did consider trying to build that bike up with all original parts, but if you've tried to buy old school bike parts at the minute, you know they're either really hard to get hold of or they cost an absolute fortune. I was really lucky to see this bike at a reasonable price, in good condition, in exactly the same spec that I had it, so yeah, it'd be rude not to. Now, one reason I want to show you this bike is because it's close to my heart, and I think a lot of you guys will find it quite interesting how I started my journey riding bikes. I still consider myself quite young, but yeah, a lot of you guys will look at this bike and think this is ancient. But when I got this, this was pretty much state of the art. It had some of the best gear on it, and I'm going to run you through exactly what it does have, what made it good for me, what made it really hard for me, and go through there. Because a lot of people ask, what is the best bike to start trials on? And I just want to show you guys and explain that it really doesn't matter. I mean, some bikes are going to be slightly easier than others, but if I can ride a bike like this and enter a year's worth of competitions, come third overall, I don't think it matters too much about what bike you're going to ride. As long as it's got wheels, it's got brakes, and it rolls, it's going to work. But anyway, let's go into detail and show you exactly what makes this bike tick.
Like I said, this is in great condition with no real scrapes or dents, although I did buy a new set of decals. The Avalanche sat just below the Zasca in the 1996 catalogue, but both shared a similar silhouette with GT's classic triple triangle frame design. You might think I was inspired by Hans Ray and that's why I got a GT, but actually I'd never heard of him at that point and just got this bike because it was reduced in a local shop. It's made from 7005 aluminium, which is pretty light. I believe this model was made in the USA. Now you may think that's a crack where the seat stays join the top tube. I know I did, but on further inspection it's just the light making it look like one. It's an 18-inch frame, which was a bit of a struggle for me as a 12 or 13-year-old, but I still had an absolute blast riding it. A lot of bikes in the mid-90s had 1-inch head tubes, which wasn't so reliable. The GT had a 1 1/8 head tube, which was a real bonus. It meant that headsets actually stayed tight and there were good aftermarket options available. The original fork was steel, which they also did one with suspension, which wasn't the lightest, or strongest for that matter, but at least you could fit a strong one easily if or when this broke. Ah, look who's sneaking in. Honestly, he's got a one-track mind, that guy. At the top of the fork, there's a core stem. I've actually got a bit of a soft spot for core stems because of this bike, despite it being as long as a narrowboat. But this was fairly standard back then. 130mm didn't look out of place and helped you put in a more comfortable riding position, as these old bikes were pretty short. Interestingly, competition trials have kept the long stem and taken it to more extremes. 160mm is quite normal, Add high-rise bars tilted forwards to give an equivalent of a 260mm or more stem, and it starts to make this core stem look stumpy in comparison. Why this is the case is a topic for another day. Hey look, it's the cute Thief Mark II's girlfriend, Fifi. Although it looks like they're having a quarrel, so I'll leave them be. To go with the long stem, there's some very narrow flat bars. I've never known how narrow they are, but turns out they're even narrower than I thought at 570mm, which is 22.5 inches. My usual inspired bars aren't the widest at 730, but they dwarf the GTs. I remember getting some Club Roost bars as one of my first upgrades, as the narrowest didn't feel great. I also wanted more rise, as all the cool guys in MBUK had bigger bars, though sadly Ozonics were out of my price range. There wasn't really much to note about the saddle. Of course I ran it slammed, but even then it mostly just got in the way. Although I do remember ripping my seat badly and some people teasing me about it at my first comp. I'll probably replace this with a Club Roost product too. Cranks are one area that's seen a huge change over the years on both my mountain bike and trials bike. Square tapered cranks weren't the burliest, and I did eventually round mine off. They got replaced by the classic FSA Power Pro cranks, which didn't last long either. Speaking of things that didn't last long, my biggest chainring was used as my bash ring, and I pummeled it into the local walls until it was unrecognisable. I bet my parents loved that. Triple chainrings were the norm back then, which was great for gear ranges, especially because we only had 8 gears on the back. It's funny how bikes back then had 21 gears compared with today's meagre 11. I remember being so stoked on this XT rear mech. I couldn't believe I owned a bike with the second best part you could buy. Pretty sure I smashed it fairly quickly, as was common when riding trials. Still, I'm glad this is another item that's evolved over the years. Because they didn't have a clutch, they were free to swing about and cause an absolute racket. No need to ask walkers to move out of the way, they'd hear you coming a mile off. Modern bikes are so much quieter and so much more reliable. Anyone riding an older bike knows the pain of a dropped chain on every bumpy downhill. The cassette looks so small, but at least the gears still work. Mine never did, as I constantly had a bent mech or bent mech hanger. It's been so long since I've used a bike with front gears. This seems so odd now. Moving to the rear wheel, I'm going to explain why this was probably quite crap for trials use. One thing that's really handy for trials and any technical riding is having lots of engagement points in the hub. It means less slack at the cranks, giving more control. As you can see here, there's very few engagements in this old Shimano one, resulting in lots of slack and making trials techniques noticeably harder to execute. The hub is also pretty quiet, which usually means the springs in the ratchet aren't pushing the poles with much force. That lack of force can mean they don't engage fully, causing the hub to skip under power. The last thing you want when kicking off a drop. Bent axles weren't uncommon too, which made trying to remove the quick release rather interesting. At least the front wheel didn't have to do as much, so coped much better. No disc mounts on the forker hub, as rim brakes ruled the roost back then, and we'll get onto brakes shortly. But sticking with the wheels, the other struggle I had was with the rims. Mavic 221s were decent for XC, but nowhere near wide or burly enough to cope with downhill or trials. I remember splitting my rim after a heavy impact. Easy now. Thinking back, the brakes had probably worn the rim walls quite thin, but either way they got replaced by some Sun Mammoths, which I really liked. Now on these rims are some absolute classic tyres, the WTB Velociraptors. These were front and rear specific, and they meant it. The rear tyre was essentially made up of just paddles. This would make an awful front tyre with no emphasis on turning grip. You don't see many rear tyres looking like this these days, so I guess there must be a reason. And no, it's not on backwards. This direction is for dry cross country apparently. The front version is completely the opposite, with it concentrating solely on directional tread to aid steering. I have no idea how well this combo worked, as one of my first changes I made after puncturing on almost every ride was to get some burlier IRC Kudro tyres, which I absolutely loved. Moving on, the bike didn't come with the original pedals, so I found a pair of Club Roost traction caged models, which was an upgrade I did at some point. It's possible it's these models that gave me my first dose of being hit on the shin, forcing me to Blue Peter myself a set of homemade shin pads from an old washing up bottle and elastic bands. Yeah, that's something I actually did. Even though I'm not a huge fan, cage pedals are still popular with competition riders as they can be made extremely light. As much as I liked this bike, the brakes were always a major negative. Before disc brakes were V-brakes, and before V-brakes were cantilever brakes. Other than better mud clearance than U-brakes that came before these, there really wasn't much else good about them. They could be very hard to set up, had bad cable routing, but mostly they're just not very powerful. These days, most serious riders use a single finger to activate the brakes and don't give it much thought. However, even with my adult strength, I have to use 2 fingers to lock the wheels with these brakes. This means I'm reducing my grip on the bars and losing some control. However, there were even sometimes young me would have to use 3 fingers due to my tiny child arms, which left my little finger to do all the gripping on the bar. Not ideal. It took me years to unlearn using 2 fingers on the brakes, even after a few bikes after this one and with much better brakes. In fact, I had to force myself to use 1 finger by buying a set of RB levers which only had room for 1 finger each. Magura hydraulic brakes were around in the mid-90s, but sadly were out of my budget, and there are no trial-specific pads like we have these days. I'm so glad brakes have gotten better, as these really do suck. Now we've seen the bike, let's take it outside and try a few hops, see how it rides. I can barely lock the wheels. This will be interesting. Now the lack of hub engagements is extremely noticeable. It's actually more impactful than the less than ideal geometry. Although the quietness is nice. I'd still rather have a louder hub to give more confidence though. Brakes are shocking as I mentioned. 2-finger braking needed, which feels so sketchy. On the plus side though, bad brakes mean you have no choice but to get your body weight in the optimal place, making you get the techniques more dialed in. Silver linings, I guess. The rest of the bike is surprisingly okay. I mean, the frame size will limit how big you can go, but the geometry, long stem and narrow bars doesn't feel as awful as I expected. I think the key thing to try and get on any bike you might want to do trials on is to make sure the brakes are good and to have at least 40 or more engagements in the hub, preferably a hub that's got good reliability. You may find parts break once you start to push things, which is where a trial specific bike will help, as it will definitely last longer. But for learning the basics without sinking money into a specialist bike, an ordinary bike is a fine option. So, not the easiest to ride, but still capable of some half decent trials. I think it would be interesting to compare it to what I'm riding 26 years later. I know the GT isn't a trials bike, so it's not a true example of bike evolution, but it's still interesting to see what changes have made it easier to ride trials on my Inspired. Other than the wheel size, everything has changed, and for the better. There's obviously a ton more room to move with a lower frame and saddle. Plus, the higher bottom bracket and smaller sprocket gives an extra 100mm of ground clearance. Because this is a street trials bike, the shorter stem and higher bars make it so much easier to bunny hop. And it's funny how the bars in the GT are only at headset level on the Inspired. Everything is bigger and burlier, yet much easier to ride 26 years on. Even my wheels look bigger due to using larger tyres. And carbon rims were a long way off in the mid-90s, certainly to the quality we get these days from brands like Light Bicycle. But surely one of the biggest improvements has to be the brakes. Cables have been swapped to hydraulics, and braking surfaces no longer have to also hold the tyres on. How spoilt we are. You might think with modern bikes being bigger, strong enough to cope with 10-foot drops to flat multiple times a day, that they would be heavier. So let's see how my first bike weighs in against my latest one. 13 kilos for the GT, and 10.2 for the Inspired. So not only stronger, but significantly lighter too.
So there you go everyone, a bit of a trip down memory lane for you, certainly for me anyway. I'm sure a lot of you older guys will probably remember bikes like this and just how much technology has improved. It's really interesting comparing this with my Hex that I just built, the 2022 bike. You can't get any newer than that. Technology has come a long way. Not only are bikes nicer to ride these days, you can go faster, you can go harder, they're easier to maintain, they last longer. My Hex, for example, is 2 kilos lighter than this, yet it's also a hell of a lot stronger. Now a lot of those weight savings will come from a lighter seat and post. I don't have a cassette and gears on my Hex, but my Hex is definitely a lot stronger than this. I certainly wouldn't fancy taking this off a 10-foot drop 3 times a day doing shows. Other than technology of just how frames are made, it's interesting to see how geometry has changed as well. Now, my Hex isn't the most extreme geometry when it comes to trials riding. Competition trials bikes have got really extreme, as I showed you with the handlebar and stem. But my Hex still has a much higher bottom bracket than this, a much shorter chainstays, which makes it a lot easier on the back wheel and gives it a lot more clearance for getting over obstacles. Like I mentioned, my chainring was smashed to smithereens when I used to ride this thing, trying to get up walls and rocks near my house when I was growing up. But I think to me, one of the biggest improvements has got to be the brakes. Oh my word, trying to use these brakes as a 12 or 13-year-old, I wasn't exactly strong. Trying to pull these levers took all my strength, and I really struggled. I remember using these brakes and thinking, oh, I wonder what disc brakes are like, because disc brakes were kind of just about coming out. And I just used to daydream about having disc brakes one day, and yeah, those dreams have come true. Brakes nowadays, disc brakes are just unreal, and that's probably the biggest improvement in bike technology I've experienced over these years. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, I get asked a lot, what is the best bike to start on? Well, if myself as a small 12 and 13-year-old can ride this massive cross-country bike with crap brakes and do fairly well at comps, then you can start on anything. Don't worry too much about what bike it is. Just as long as you can get a bike that suits your budget, you're better to have any bike than no bike. You can learn so much on a bike like this, all the basics, and because it's actually quite hard to ride, you teach yourself so much about body positioning, how to get your weight positioned where it needs to be to get the tricks done. So I actually think riding a bike that's not designed for trials actually teaches you a lot of really useful skills. But not everyone wants to suffer, so if you do want to learn how to ride trials, then yeah, probably a trials bike is best, but like I mentioned, don't stress too much about it. Just get out on your bike and learn some cool stuff. Now, don't expect a riding video on this other than just a few hops outside. I've already done a video riding my original frame and it was good fun, but I did eventually break it and I don't want to break this bike. I want to keep it in good condition. So this is going to go back up on the wall. Maybe one day when I get a big office, I can have this bike on display. This is the bike that started this whole journey, my obsession. And yeah, it'd be quite nice just to have it on display, on show for me to look at and for any visitors to look at. I hope you enjoyed this show and tell. Let me know down in the comments. If you want to support this channel, don't forget I have a Patreon, I have merch available at clarkson.com, and I do accept PayPal donations as well. All of these things really do help make this channel possible. But let me know what you thought of this one, and I hope you have an amazing week, and I'll catch you next time. So take care everyone, bye bye.